This is hallowed ground. Hallowed spiritually, but hallowed physically. Welcome to Forest City, the northern gateway to the anthracite region.
This colliery is located in Clifford Township, Susquehanna County, and is therefore outside my district. It consists of a drift, which is worked by the Hillside Coal and Iron Company. A fatal accident occurred at this colliery on the 6th day of December, caused by the premature explosion of a blast. The powder exploded, killing Gil Martin instantly and severely injuring Donahue. The accident was properly reported to me by Mr. Hine, but I did not feel I had any right to make an investigation because the colliery is not within my district.
This would be the first of dozens of fatalities in Forest City coal mines and collieries. Forest City is located at the northern tip of the Pennsylvania northern field of the anthracite region, and it's where the borders of Susquehanna, Lackawanna, and Wayne County meet. And Forest City is the central hub, you could say, and is surrounded by the communities of Vanling, Browndale, and Richmonddale. But generally, the whole area is known as Forest City in vernacular. Locals will typically differentiate between the smaller communities.
The custom was, if a miner was killed, he was taken home and left on the porch of his house for his wife and family.
Forest City didn't get its name out of nowhere. The primary industry here upon its founding was lumber, as you can imagine. And primarily, the Delaware and Hudson Coal Company took an interest in the lumber that could be supplied here for use in their coal mines further to the south, say in Carbondale or Scranton. But soon they would take much more of an interest in what the town had to offer underground. It's unclear exactly when coal was properly discovered here in Forest City. It is known that sometime prior to 1871, founder William Pentecost had a small operation that he would use to supply the locals with coal, just simply for heating, cooking, blacksmithing. Small type of thing, small operation. However, after 1871 is when we start seeing commercial coal mining starting to take place in Forest City. That first outcropping of coal was discovered along the Jefferson branch of the D&H Railroad, somewhere up the track from where I'm filming here, which would have been next to the original Forest City breaker, which would be to my right, where the current Forest City Emergency Services is located. Like many other mining towns, Forest City saw an influx of immigrants coming from overseas. And compared to the usual demographics of most coal mining towns, the Irish and Welsh were already pretty well established in the core regions. But by the time Forest City mines started developing, we started seeing a lot more of Eastern European immigrants coming in, such as Lithuanian, Polish, Russian, and there were Austrians mixed in as well, even though they're strictly not Eastern European. But the one common thing that each of these immigrants had in common, they called Forest City their home when they came to the United States. And they all called the coal industry their profession. At the time it wasn't known, but Forest City was at the northern tip of the Pottsville and Lewin formations, which are the traditional coal-bearing formations in eastern Pennsylvania. To the north is the older Catskill Formation, which has no large deposits of coal. When you look at mine maps, you will see outside of the workings diamond drill holes marked labeled no vein or bearing, which shows that they tried looking for coal further but had no luck. In the middle of town here, there's this monument here dedicated to the coal miners who labored and died inside the mines in all the anthracite region. And most people, they drive by, it's just another monument, just another collection of brick and bronze. Well, Forest City, maybe it never was a major mining town like the way Carbondale and Wilkes-Barre and Scranton were. But 30,000 coal miners were killed in Pennsylvania anthracite mines. Forest City would contribute 282 to that total. Because of the nature of anthracite, the mechanization of the bituminous fields was difficult to implement. Coal would be removed in room and pillar mining. Miners would drill blast holes in the face, blast it out with explosives, and laborers load it into coal cars. About half the coal would be left in place to support the ground above the workings. In many mines later on, these pillars would be robbed out, leaving nothing to hold the roof up. The coal would then be taken up narrow gauge rails to the surface in the breaker. Even the transportation was dangerous. Many accidents occurred involving the mine cars in the narrow passageways. At the breaker, the cars would be emptied. Unskilled workers, sometimes children, would remove the waste rock from the coal. The coal would be crushed and screened, and sometimes the process repeated until the desired quantities were reached. Afterwards, it was often loaded into trains and shipped by railroad to market. It wasn't unusual for workers to get hurt or killed. On average, Forest City would see a fatality every 3 or 4 months. It fluctuated. Sometimes there'd be one fatality a decade. Sometimes it'd be nearly once a month. Sometimes multiple in a day. Some mines would be equipped with hospitals, but these were little more than glorified first aid stations. At present, it's unknown whether Forest City had any. The common practice was for non-major injuries. The worker would have to wait for either a lunch break or the end of shift to return to the surface and seek medical attention. For major injuries, the breaker whistle that typically marked the start and end of the shift would blast 3 sharp times to indicate a serious event had occurred. The whole town would hear it and emergency responders would rush to the breaker. The injured would be carted or carried to the surface. Forest City had no regular hospitals, and if the local doctor was in over his head, the injuries would be sent to Carbondale and even Scranton for the treatment. Many death certificates from Forest City mines say the deceased died in these cities for the reason, despite the incident having occurred in the Forest City area. Often workers would be killed instantly at the breaker, or in the mine. 90% of the fatalities occurred underground. In the early days, the deceased would be left on their doorstep for their loved ones to find when they opened the door.
The very fact that coal companies would dump dead miners on the porches demonstrated the lack of concern for their employees.
Perhaps the coal company thought as a way of helping the families by promptly delivering the deceased in order to be prepared for the wake or the viewing. But many children recalled screaming in horror at the lifeless and mangled corpse that was once their father or brother outside their door. Sometimes the body would be in need of a closed casket. Sometimes the coal companies offered compensation to the widows. Perhaps a ton of coal would help see them through the winter. Perhaps there was even a life insurance policy. Often this wasn't the case. The company would attempt to weasel out of paying, and if the miner lived in company housing, his family would simply be evicted. The most dangerous place to be was underground. Death would come in dozens of ways, many expected but also unpredictable. When you go underground and you're looking in terms for, protecting yourself and safety, what are the big things you get concerned about and you're looking out for?
So the biggest things that we look out for are, rock falls, loose top, loose ribs. So that's the walls of the mine, that's the roof of the mine. Possibly something coming down and hitting you, and then we deal with explosive gases and hazardous gases, methane, or what we call fire damp, and the anthracite. That's methane that collects in the roof of the mine that is very explosive. We could then come into what's called black damp, or what we call carbon dioxide that collects in your floor of the mine. It's pretty much just low oxygen, and if you go into a patch of that, you could pass out and possibly die.
So your major concern primarily is looking above for a roof fall that could potentially happen.
Yes, so that's the main thing. And then, like I said, hazardous gases. We can't see, hear, or smell those gases. So
now, of course, when we're talking about hazardous gases, methane and risk of methane explosion, that's part of it. Now, what about the risk of explosion when it comes to actual explosives, blasting caps, dynamite, that sort of thing?
Pretty much nowadays that we use modern explosives that cannot explode unless charges put to them. Nowadays, we do not carry and we do not store our blasting caps and our explosives in the same battery or compartment. Mm-hmm. That be kept separate at all times till you're ready to blast. So pretty much, unless you connect the powder, connect the cap to it, and then connect that to your blasting battery, there's no chance of explosion.
Now, what about the risk of accidents with the equipment in terms of, say, your coal cars, your locomotives, that sort of thing? Where does that risk rank in your list of safety concerns?
personally, the mine that I work at, we have no mine locomotive. It's a hand tram buggy. I mean, it's still a hazard. We have to watch out for, and we have a slope car. It's every time you get in that car, it could be your last time getting in that car. It's a safety risk, but it's not as nearly as dangerous as roof falls or the dangerous gases. For the most part, like I said, we have what's called a gunboat. It's lowered down via cable from the hoist, and that's what brings the men in and out of the mine and the coal and any supplies we need in and out of the mine. Besides that, we have a simple mine car. It holds about a half ton to a ton of coal, and that is hand trammed. It's not motorized by any means. It's simply a guy behind it pushing a buggy back and forth.
So about as simple as it gets in terms of equipment.
Very
Much simpler than a mine locomotive.
Exactly. And besides that, we still use air drills, pneumatic drills.
More or less the technique of mining hasn't changed over the last 50, 60, 70 years, just the technology has had some slight improvements.
Exactly,
So the first death occurred in 1876. Thomas Donahue, the miner, and his laborer, John Gilmartin, they were preparing for a blast, and they were tamping powder in the hole. As they were tamping, there was a premature detonation of powder. Donahue survived with severe injuries, but John Gilmartin was killed instantly. He was the first of 282 miners to die in Forest City coal mines. Unfortunately, accidents involving explosions would kill about 10% of miners. Because Forest City was such a new operation, it only consisted of a simple drift. The accident was reported to the local authorities in Scranton. However, they declined to investigate because Forest City was outside of their jurisdiction. John Gilmartin would be the only fatality of that decade, but he was the first of many more to come. April 13th, 1907, miner Patrick Morin is killed by an explosion in the number 2 shaft of the Clark vein. There were no witnesses. It is theorized he was attempting to thaw out a keg of powder that was too damp. Blame was firmly placed upon the victim despite no witnesses. The man was mangled by the explosion. He had come from County Mayo in Ireland and had served honorably in the United States Marine Corps for 4 years prior to settling in Banling. Less than a year earlier, he had been married and had 2 children. Twins. Less than 3 months old. July 8, 1907, miners Frank Adamovich and Frank Chalesky were killed while working the lowest split of the Clark vein at the Forest City number 2 shaft. They were victims of roof fall. They had loaded 5 coal cars and were preparing to start drilling holes in the face when a piece of roof weighing several tons crushed them both to death instantly. Both were married men and Austrian and Polish by descent. They left behind wives and children. April 20th, 1931 was a particularly grim day for Forest City. 3 men had been killed in 2 separate incidents at the Stillwater Colliery. Joseph Jones, Frank Logger, and Frank Schramrow were all killed. They were all employed by the Hudson Coal Company, according to mine records. Jones was a brakeman who was crushed between a mine motor and a rib supporting a roof at 8:30 in the morning. His death certificate says Lackawanna County as the location of death, but news articles say he was working at the Stillwater Colliery. This is because he died while undergoing treatment at Carbondale General Hospital, just a few miles down the road. He was 4 days away from his 24th birthday. Logger and Shamrow are being listed as in Wayne County at the time of death. Both were killed by a roof fall at 2:10 that afternoon. Roof falls would continue to be a big killer in mines. Timbers would act more as an early warning system than roof support. By listening for the cracking and creaking of timbers, that could indicate a roof fall was imminent. However, this would often occur without warning. Logger was 1 month away from his birthday and just turned 24. Shamrow had just turned 24 as well. All 3 men were from Forest City or the neighboring community of Browndale. News articles at the time highlight the details of this. They had known each other as children and went to school together, and even played on the same baseball team the day prior. Frank Shamrow's own flesh and blood brother was witness to the roof fall, and immediately attempted to dig his brother free. I have no doubt seeing his own brother die before his eyes haunted him for the rest of his life. It was the single deadliest day in Forest City coal mines. Shamrow would be laid to rest in St. Agnes Cemetery. Logger would be buried in St. Joseph's, and Jones in Round Cemetery up the road in Uniondale. On January 9th, 1904, miners Andrew Kilhullen and Daniel Lewis were killed. They were aged 18 and 29 and had been killed in an accident involving coal cars. Unfortunately, not many details are available. One of the men was Welsh and the other man Irish. Accidents involving coal cars would be the second largest killer of Forest City miners. Even experienced men could fall victim to them. Deaths could also come from other living beings, even not human. May 15th, 1907, William Wolford Jr. was killed at 9:30 in the morning in the Clifford mines to the west of Forest City. He had been a runner and was supervising the moving of loaded coal cars by mules when he slipped and fell. By the time the animals could be stopped, he had already been run over and killed. He was 22 years old and had been born in Germany. In 1931, Joseph Petrus, aged 60, sat down for lunch inside the mine. He'd spent most of his life working underground. Suddenly, a mine car flew down the track, derailed, and struck him. It killed him as he was eating his lunch. The confined spaces inside mines would often not give men much room to escape collisions with mine cars. Some accidents could occur unexpectedly. In the number 6 drift of the Clinton Colliery on May 3, 1930, miner Joseph Zavra was killed by a broken steel cable that snapped while he was operating a loader. He was struck upon the head, given first aid, and initially sent home because the injury was not thought to be as serious as it actually was. So he rested. After a few days he showed no improvement and was sent to the hospital. He underwent an operation, but that was not enough. 1 week later he would die in the hospital in Scranton. Cause of death simply states compound fracture of the skull. He was 37 years of age, married, and had been an immigrant from Austria. Another unexpected accident was the death of Edward Conrad, age 38, at the Stillwater Colliery in October of 1918. He had been a foreman on site, and the boiler exploded, which severely scalded him. His entire face and body was covered in third-degree burns. He was buried at the Hillside Cemetery in Forest City. At the Hudson Coal Company Clinton Colliery in 1938, Joseph Durbin, age 19, is reported to have died of natural causes while walking to the office. So strangely enough, his death certificate says the cause of death was electrocution by live wire. According to the Forest City News, Durbin was killed at 8 o'clock at night while coming in contact with a live wire at the abandoned Clinton Colliery, particularly the substation that supplied it. He had apparently climbed a pole about 15 feet when he came in contact with the wire. It's reported that sparks were showering the ground underneath the boy, and another young man was electrocuted in attempts to pull Durbin free from the live wire. It's unclear whether or not he was actually employed by the coal company, but nonetheless, this is a tragic death. This incident highlights some of the dishonesty that the coal companies exhibited in regards to accidents. And unfortunately, a lot more egregious examples are soon to follow. The most recent coal miner to be killed in Forest City mines would be in 1943. Gotta remember, anthracite coal wasn't used for just heating. It has a variety of industrial uses, which was especially important, especially for steel production during the war. Michael Hydock, age 59, was injured on August 27, 1943. He succumbed to his injuries on September 2nd. The exact nature of the accident is unknown at present, but his death certificate states he suffered multiple fractures to the clavicle. He had been born in Europe and had been in the United States for 43 years. Like thousands of other immigrants, he came to the U.S. to better himself and build a life for himself, only to be killed by the ground he stood upon and called home. On January 28, 1904, we have one of the more tragic accidents. Slate pickers Thomas Storminsky and Stanley Voloney were killed. They had been smothered by a pile of coal and suffocated to death. According to state records, Voloney was 23 and Storminsky was 15. However, Historical Society records indicate that Storminsky was actually named John Storinsky and aged 13. State records may have incorrect information to disguise his real age and the fact that the coal companies had broken child labor laws. In the years prior, it had been normal for boys to lie about their age to work. Often this was because the father needed help feeding the family. In other mines, boys as young as 9 or 10 would lie about their age and be put to work, just like the men. Storinsky would be the youngest worker killed in the Forest City coal mine. Boys under the age of 18 would account for roughly 3% of those killed in Forest City mines. Breaker accidents and minecart collisions would be the biggest killers of boys. They typically performed supporting roles to the miners prior to becoming laborers or miners themselves. These boys never got to know childhood innocence. Now, you may be wondering why I bother to bring some of these specific instances to your attention. 282 men and boys died in Forest City coal mines. That's 282 individual and unique lives, the same as you or I. They were united by the common fact that they all needed to make a living, and they all lived in or around Forest City. Remember, on average, it was one fatality every 3 to 4 months. And keep in mind, that was not a constant throughout the entire life of the Forest City coal industry. Sometimes it was one fatality a decade. Sometimes you would see a fatality a month. Sometimes you'd see multiple fatalities in a day. By no means was it uncommon for workers to die in the coal industry. What I'm hoping to do here is to bring some humanity to the names on the list, the statistics on the paper, the men that are represented by the coal monuments, because each of these men, they died underneath our feet. I've worked at sites where some of these breakers were located and where some of these boys were suffocated underneath the calm banks, where decades later, I'd be drilling through that same calm. I have stood at or over some of the entrances to some of these mines that have been long since backfilled, where these men, they walked down and then they had to be carried out. I have family entombed in some of the same cemeteries that these men have been buried in. I have ancestors that more than likely worked with some of these men, called them friends, neighbors, perhaps even best friends. Each name on that list, each of the 282 names, was a life. The same as yours or mine. May each of those men rest in peace and never forget what they put themselves through just to make a living at that time.